That's all right.
The-
I've accepted the fact.
Emmylou Harris has often said that music was never a place of escape for her. It was a place of confrontation. And that truth becomes even clearer when you follow the quiet shape of her later years, when the urgency of ambition faded and what remained was memory, responsibility, and the slow reckoning that comes when a life has been lived almost entirely in service to sound. As time passed, Emmylou did not drift into obscurity, nor did she cling desperately to relevance. Instead, she occupied a rarer position. She became a reference point. Younger artists sought her not for advice alone, but for validation. Her presence on a record carried a kind of moral weight, as if harmony itself became more truthful when her voice entered the mix. She sang with Lucinda Williams, Gillian Welch, Alison Krauss, Steve Earle, Mark Knopfler. Each collaboration was less about spotlight and more about listening. She rarely led with dominance. She blended, she supported, she elevated. Yet even as her professional life grew richer in meaning, her personal solitude deepened. Touring became more selective. She chose fewer shows, fewer cities, fewer obligations. Long bus rides and hotel rooms that once felt like necessary sacrifices now felt like echoes of an older life she no longer wanted to repeat in full. When she returned home, silence greeted her. Not the sharp silence of loss, but a familiar stillness she had learned to inhabit without fear. Animals filled that stillness. Dogs, particularly rescued ones, became companions not in the sentimental sense, but in the practical rhythm of care. Feeding, walking, sitting together. Their presence grounded her in routine and responsibility without demanding explanation. In interviews, she has spoken about them with more openness than she ever did about romantic love. There was no performance required, no past to justify, no future to promise. Motherhood, too, took on a different shape as the years went by. The guilt she once carried for distance and absence softened into something quieter, more reflective. Her daughters grew into their own lives, no longer defined by what Emmylou had or had not been able to give during her most relentless years. Conversations became easier, expectations loosened, the sharp edges of regret dulled, not because they vanished, but because time finally allowed space for forgiveness on both sides. In this later period, Emmylou also became more politically and socially vocal, though never loud. Her activism mirrored her music, steady, principled, and resistant to spectacle. Landmine-free world was not a fashionable cause when she embraced it. It was uncomfortable, remote, easy to ignore. That, perhaps, was precisely why it mattered to her. She understood the cost of wars that never truly end because she had grown up watching the consequences linger silently in her own father. Her voice, aging naturally, did not retreat. It changed. The crystalline clarity of her youth gave way to something more textured, more weathered. Cracks appeared, but they were not flaws. They were evidence. Listeners who followed her for decades recognized that she no longer sang from longing alone, but from understanding. From the knowledge that not everything resolves, and not every wound is meant to close. When she stepped onto stage in her 70s, there was no attempt to recreate the past, no effort to dress youthfully or frame herself as timeless. She stood simply, often still, allowing the songs to move while she remained anchored. Applause came, but she never chased it. If anything, she seemed slightly surprised by its persistence, as if she had already made peace with being done, yet music kept calling her back. In private moments, friends describe her as gentle, wry, deeply observant, someone who listens far more than she speaks, someone who remembers everything but rarely uses memory as a weapon. The intensity that once drove her relentlessly through albums and tours softened into discernment. She learned when to say no, when to rest, when to remain silent. What stands out most, looking back, is not how much she gave up, but how clearly she understood the cost of what she chose. Emmylou Harris never pretended that devotion to music was compatible with every version of domestic life. She did not romanticize sacrifice. She acknowledged it, lived with it, and transformed it into something others could recognize themselves in. Her songs continue to resonate because they are not written from triumph, they are written from endurance. from the quiet knowledge that not everything resolves and not every wound is meant to close. When Emmylou did build a life that fits neatly into cultural ideals, she built one that reflects reality, fragmented, costly, beautiful in ways that cannot be summarized by awards or relationships. And when her voice rises now, lower, slower, carrying decades of choices within it, listeners hear not just music, but permission. Permission to live imperfectly, to choose one truth over another, to remain whole even when life refuses to simplify. Emmylou Harris never planned for legacy. That word belongs to institutions, not to people who live by instinct and necessity. Yet as the decades stretched on, legacy began to form around her whether she acknowledged it or not through monuments or public statements, but through the quiet way her absence from the center reshaped the center itself. When she stepped back, space appeared for others. When she refused to dominate, others learned how to listen. In the late years of her career, Emmylou's presence became almost monastic. She arrived at rehearsals early, left quietly, avoided the celebratory rituals that often follow performances. She no longer drank the adrenaline of applause. It had lost its intoxicating effect. What mattered to her now was tone, placement, intention, whether a harmony lifted the lead singer or crowded them, whether a lyric landed honestly or merely passed by. She treated music like something sacred but fragile, something that could be damaged if handled carelessly. There was also an unspoken exhaustion that followed her, not physical alone, but emotional, a tiredness that comes from having spent a lifetime being strong without ever fully resting inside another person's certainty. For years, relationships required her to compress herself, to make room for others' needs while never relinquishing the demands of music. By choosing solitude later in life, she did not reject love, she redefined it. Love for her became loyalty without possession, connection without obligation, presence without permanence. Friends noticed how carefully she guarded her time. Invitations declined politely, conversations ended gently. She had learned, painfully, that overextension was the first step towards losing herself. That lesson came not from theory, but from the cumulative erosion of years spent trying to balance incompatible worlds. Motherhood, marriage, collaboration, touring, each required full attention. Giving all of them simultaneously nearly hollowed her out. In solitude, Emmylou found something resembling peace, not happiness in the conventional sense, but alignment. Days structured simply, long walks, reading without pressure to release, listening to records not for research, but for pleasure. She returned often to the voices that had once shaped her, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, not to imitate them, but to remember the moment before ambition took over, when music was still a private refuge rather than a public obligation. Her house reflected this simplicity. No shrine to her own achievements, few awards on display, instruments leaned casually against walls rather than encased like relics. Animals moved freely through rooms, interrupting silence without apology. The house felt lived in, not curated, a place meant to be occupied, not admired. As the Americana movement gained traction in the 2000s, journalists began retroactively crowning Emmylou as one of its architects. She resisted the label, uncomfortable with the implication that she had set out to define a genre. She had not. She had simply followed instinct away from places that no longer felt honest. Americana, if it meant anything to her, was permission. Permission to blur lines, permission to age without erasure, permission to value story over polish. Younger artists often spoke of encountering her with a mixture of awe and relief. Awe at her history, relief at her non-pretension. She did not offer grand advice. She asked questions instead. She listened, and when she sang harmony on someone else's record, she never attempted to claim ownership of the moment. Her voice entered like a blessing, not a declaration. Yet even in these years of relative calm, the past did not disappear. Loss has a way of resurfacing when life slows down. Memories of Graham Parsons, of early motherhood, of marriages that failed not through malice but through incompatibility. These things returned not as wounds but as companions. She carried them quietly, without needing to explain or resolve them. Her songs from this period reflect that acceptance, less dramatic, more spacious. Grief no longer sharp but persistent,
like a weather system that never fully clears. Live performances took on a different quality. She stood still more often, let the band carry motion. Her voice, lower and more fragile, required closer attention from listeners. It demanded patience. Those who leaned in were rewarded with something rare, an intimacy that did not beg for sympathy, but offered truth. There were moments backstage after shows when she admitted feeling surprised she was still doing this at all, not out of resentment, but wonder. Music had outlasted every other structure in her life. It had outlasted marriages, career cycles, trends, and losses. It remained when everything else proved temporary. That realization brought both comfort and weight. Music was no longer just what she did, it was the one relationship that had never left. Her relationship with silence deepened. She no longer feared it. Silence became a collaborator, shaping phrasing, allowing space between notes. In interviews, she spoke more slowly, chose words carefully.